May 1945. The war was ending, but the world still smelled of gunpowder and wet earth. On a quiet morning in Massachusetts, the rumble of trucks echoed through Main Street. Canvas-covered vehicles, their sides marked U.S. Army transport, carried an unexpected cargo. Female German prisoners of war. Some were nurses from Luftwaffe field hospitals, others typists or radio clerks from fallen outposts in France. Their hands were loosely shackled, their uniforms stripped of insignia, their faces hidden behind fatigue and fear. The townspeople stood along the sidewalks, silent. No one clapped, no one jeered, just the sound of engines and the low whine of wind between buildings still draped in victory banners. Then something happened that no military protocol could predict. A small girl, no more than 8, broke from her mother's grip and ran toward the convoy. She held a bouquet of daisies, wrapped in paper still damp from the morning rain. A soldier shouted, the mother gasped, but before anyone could react, the girl reached the truck and placed the flowers on the metal side panel. The bouquet slid down slowly, catching on a rusted bolt before resting near the chained hands of a young German prisoner. The woman froze. For a second, the entire convoy seemed to stop breathing. The guard nearest her, Private James Holloway, 19, son of a Boston dock worker, started to intervene. But when he saw the woman's trembling fingers reach toward the flowers, he hesitated. The command manual didn't cover this. He turned his head away and let the silence hold. A reporter from the Boston Herald, stationed by the curb, would later write, "The enemy looked at the child as though she had undone the war." That description, buried in the May 12, 1945 edition, remains one of the few surviving records of the moment. The woman's name was Lieselotte Brandt, 23, formerly attached to the Luftwaffe's 4th Air District in Bremen. Her diary, later confiscated by U.S. intelligence, contained a single line for that day. "I did not know we were still visible as humans." That single gesture, a child's instinct to give flowers to the enemy, cut deeper than any headline of victory. It was the first spark of something that neither army nor propaganda could control: compassion between people who had been taught to hate. And as the truck rolled away, petals fluttered from the bouquet and scattered down the street, yellow and white against the gray dust of war. The camera of history might not have captured it, but memory did. It was the instant when both sides seemed to understand that though the war was won, humanity was what needed saving next. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. History feels different in every corner of the world. They were not soldiers in the sense history likes to remember. They had not stormed beaches or fired rifles. Most were barely trained auxiliaries. The Luftwaffe's clerical corps, Red Cross nurses or telephone operators, drafted in the final months of chaos. Yet when they arrived in American camps, they were met not as individuals, but as symbols of a defeated empire. To the victors, they carried not weapons, but the moral weight of the swastika. At Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, one of the few U.S. facilities designated for female Axis prisoners, camp records from July 1945 list precisely 512 women, mostly from captured medical and communications units. The files describe a consistent state of quiet confusion, as many of the prisoners had never even seen combat. Some still wore their civilian shoes. Many had been captured while evacuating field hospitals in France or Belgium. For them, captivity began not with violence, but with disbelief. In one Red Cross interview, a woman named Margaret Hahn, a 27-year-old typist from Dresden, said, "I thought they would hate us more than we hated ourselves." What terrified her most was not the camp fence, but the gaze of American women who came to deliver laundry or food supplies. She wrote in her confiscated notebook, "They looked at me as if I were a photograph of everything they despised." But something shifted in those stares. Hunger has a way of making enemies look fragile. As the weeks passed, townspeople began to notice the prisoners' exhaustion. The thin arms, the coughing fits, the hollow cheeks. At first, pity was an embarrassment. Then it became unavoidable. On Sundays, when the guards allowed the women to walk the perimeter for exercise, local farm wives stood near the outer fence. They didn't speak. They simply watched. One day, an old woman lifted a thermos of coffee and gestured as if offering it through the wire. The guard shook his head, but the gesture remained, an unspoken truce between people who understood what loss looked like. By autumn, camp officers reported a visible change. Fewer disciplinary issues, more requests for sewing supplies, and a strange calm replacing the early defiance. Some of the American staff began leaving magazines and newspapers near the gate. Life, Ladies' Home Journal, even a local paper with photographs of baseball games and weddings. Small, ordinary pieces of peace. These women, once faces of the enemy, were slowly being rewritten by their captors' everyday humanity. Not through lectures, but through the small kindnesses that crossed the fence without permission. The irony was cruel and beautiful, that the ones least involved in the fighting now carried the deepest burden of representing guilt. Yet, in that weight, they began to rediscover something the war had stolen. The simple recognition of being seen, not as uniforms, but as women. And in the ledger of history, where statistics often erase emotion, Fort Oglethorpe stands as quiet proof that empathy can bloom even in bureaucratic ink. Texas, October 1945. The heat still clung to the red clay roads around the small camp outside Temple, where a detachment of female German prisoners was being held under U.S. Women's Army Corps supervision. The war was officially over, but the dust of bitterness hadn't settled. The camp's sign read simply, WWII Female POW Detachment. Beyond the wire, fields stretched toward the horizon, dotted with yellow sunflowers and the white fences of cattle farms. Inside the barracks, the prisoners lived a routine of silence. They rose at dawn, lined up for roll call, and worked in the camp's laundry or kitchens. Many were widows at 20. Most had lost families they could no longer write to. The letters they attempted to send home were censored, pages sliced by scissors that left only fragments of meaning. Yet it wasn't cruelty that haunted them. It was absence. Then came a morning that no one expected. A local woman, Mary Ellen Watkins, 32, war widow from nearby Belton, walked to the gate carrying a basket. She had lost her husband in the Ardennes offensive that winter. The guards knew her. Her brother worked as a camp driver. When she asked permission to leave something for the prisoners, no one knew what she meant until she opened the basket. Inside were small loaves of cornbread, and on top, a bouquet of fresh zinnias. When the women saw the colors through the fence, they froze. Some thought it was a test, others turned away, but Mary Ellen stood quietly and said only one sentence. Witnesses remembered it word for word. "I lost my husband, but you lost your youth." Then she placed the basket on the ground and walked away. There was no speech, no announcement, no photographer, just the sound of cicadas and the creak of her shoes on the gravel. One guard later told investigators that the Germans began to cry without making a sound. That single act, one bouquet, one sentence, would appear months later in the Red Cross International Bulletin, October 1945, described as a spontaneous incident of psychological reversal. No political officer could have planned it better. It dismantled the machinery of propaganda with the quiet power of sincerity. That night, one of the prisoners, Anna Voigt, former radio operator, wrote in her journal, "We had been told they would never forgive us, but perhaps forgiveness does not ask permission." Across the camp, someone placed the flowers in a tin can of water, setting it on a windowsill. The next morning, when sunlight broke through the slats, the petals had begun to wilt, but the scent remained, sharp, sweet, defiant. It was the quietest rebellion of all, compassion without ceremony. If the war had been a contest of ideologies, this was its most unexpected victory, not on the battlefield, but between two women who had both lost everything and decided, for a moment, to stop losing. Winter arrived early in 1946. The wind across the camp carried the smell of wood smoke and boiled coffee from the guards' canteen. Inside the barracks, the women had started keeping tiny treasures, bits of lace, buttons, pebbles from the yard, anything that wasn't uniform gray. It was during one of those cold mornings that Helga Klein, a 25-year-old translator from Hamburg, found something that would change the way she remembered captivity forever. She was cleaning the narrow window ledge when a nurse named Marta Schreiber called her over. The camp's guards had allowed local women to send small care baskets, bread, sewing thread, even flowers, under supervision. That day, one of those baskets held a cluster of wild asters wrapped in paper. When Helga lifted the stems to place them in water, she felt a stiff fold hidden among them. She opened it carefully. On a piece of thin, lined stationery were 4 words written in an elegant, rounded hand. For peace, not pity. There was no signature, no name, no address. Just those 4 words. The handwriting looked American, maybe a woman's. For a moment, Helga thought it was a trick or a guard's joke. But then she realized the note had been tucked deep inside the bouquet, as though it were meant to be discovered only by accident. That night, she wrote about it in her diary. "Someone out there believes peace can be personal. I do not yet." Later, that same diary, marked Camp Alberta, February 1946, was retrieved by the International Tracing Service. The small paper note was still folded between its pages when Helga returned to Bonn in 1947. That message would haunt her for decades. It wasn't a gesture of mercy. It was a challenge. The words, "for peace, not pity," suggested equality, not defeat. It was as if the sender wanted to say, "I see you, not as a victim, but as someone who must learn to live again." Years later, Helga would tell a journalist that the hardest part of imprisonment was realizing she had to rebuild her sense of self without ideology, without orders, without hatred. The note, she said, became her compass. In the barracks, she shared its meaning quietly. Some of the women wept, others scoffed, calling it sentimental. But for Helga, the folded paper felt like a seed in her pocket, light, almost invisible, yet alive. The guards never found the note. They never needed to. Its message had already escaped the camp. By spring, when the snow melted, the asters were gone. Only the paper remained, soft from being unfolded too many times. Helga pressed it between the pages of a prayer book she had once hidden from inspection. When asked why she kept it, she wrote one line that survived in her repatriation file. "Because words last longer than fences." By the summer of 1946, the rhythm of captivity had settled into something almost ordinary. The fences still stood, but inside, life had begun to resemble a strange, fragile imitation of peace. At Fort Devens, Massachusetts, and at several camps across Alberta, Canada, the female German prisoners were allowed to work in small vegetable gardens, an experiment meant to occupy idle hands. What began as a practical measure soon became something quietly radical. The first rows were planted with onions and beans, then with spinach and cabbage. But one morning, the prisoners discovered something unexpected among the supply baskets that arrived from the nearby town. Tiny paper envelopes labeled zinnia, larkspur, sweet pea. No one knew who had placed them there. They weren't part of the approved list from the War Department. Someone, perhaps a farmer's wife, perhaps a Red Cross volunteer, had slipped in packets of flower seeds. At first, the women hesitated. Was this allowed? Would they be punished for wasting soil meant for food? But curiosity outweighed fear. Along the edge of the barbed wire fence, where the guards rarely looked, they dug shallow holes and sowed the seeds. Days turned into weeks, rain came, and then one afternoon, color appeared where there had only been gray, soft petals pushing through the dry soil, trembling in the wind. The guards noticed first, then the townspeople. Someone nicknamed the strip of earth the Garden of Forgiveness. The name stuck. When the War Department's inspection team visited in June 1946, the official report described a remarkable transformation of morale. One captain noted, "Prisoners now tend the garden with devotional attention. Hostility among them and toward personnel has markedly decreased." Helga Klein, the woman who had found the note inside the flowers months earlier, wrote another entry that summer. "We plant where we were meant to rot." She and Anna Voigt often worked side by side in the mornings, their hands caked with soil, their hair tied back with rags. The seeds became a kind of language between them, each flower a silent word that couldn't be censored. Sometimes, American women passing the outer fence left small tin cups of water near the posts. No one ever admitted to it, but every few days the cups were refilled. It became a quiet ritual. Compassion performed anonymously, like prayer without a name. The gossip in town was divided. Some locals called the women enemy gardeners. Others said it was right to let something beautiful grow, even in the aftermath of horror. One elderly farmer was quoted in the Devon's Courier. "If they can make flowers bloom in a prison, maybe we can make peace bloom out here." By late August, the fence shimmered with color. Zinnias, marigolds, daisies, a riot of life against the barbed wire. For once, it wasn't uniforms or flags that defined the camp, but something wordless, rooted, fragile. To the women, each bloom was proof that they still belonged to the world of the living, and to the guards, it was a reminder that decency could survive captivity. Tell me, if you had lived in that town, would you have left those seeds or kept your distance? Would you have dared to plant something where war had just burned everything down? By autumn, the flowers had become part of camp life, so ordinary that even the guards stopped noticing. But peace is never without its shadows. In November 1946, a new prisoner arrived, a transfer from a British holding site near Antwerp. Her name was Erika Vogel, 31, a former radio propagandist for the SS Communications Corps. Her record was heavier than the others. She had worked in Berlin's Rundfunkhaus, reading broadcasts that called Allied airmen terror flyers. As now, after 2 years in custody, she was sent to Fort Devens to await repatriation. Her arrival changed everything. The other prisoners whispered as she walked through the barracks, her boots still polished, her posture unbroken. Some avoided her, others stared with fascination. To them, she represented the part of the war they had tried to forget, the ideology that had devoured their youth. Helga, who had kept the note, "For peace, not pity," wrote, "When I saw her eyes, I saw the sound of the old radio, cold, exact, unrepentant." Outside the wire, the townspeople reacted too. News of an SS woman at the camp spread quickly. Local veterans groups protested the continued delivery of food parcels, arguing that compassion had gone too far. "Forgiveness is for the naive," one letter to the editor read in the Worcester Telegram. December 1946. A mothers' association refused to send their usual Christmas baskets that year. The small community that had once brought flowers now stood divided by doubt. A meeting was held at the local church. Some argued that charity must have limits. Others said the line between guilt and innocence had already blurred too much in the war's final years. The town's priest, Father Raymond Clark, listened quietly before speaking a single sentence that witnesses remembered decades later. Forgiveness isn't about who deserves it. It's about who can bear to live without it. Those words spread faster than any sermon. Within days, a few women returned to the fence with fresh seed packets and winter apples, silent as always. One evening, a guard noticed Helga kneeling by the frozen soil, planting something again. When he asked why, she replied simply, "Because winter still listens." Erika Vogel, meanwhile, remained aloof. But even she began to soften in the strange rhythm of the camp. She joined the others in mending uniforms for the guards, an act both humiliating and humanizing. Once, she was seen standing by the garden at dusk, touching the dried stalks through the fence. No one spoke to her, but Helga recorded the moment in her diary. She did not pick the flower. That was enough. By year's end, Fort Devens had become a mirror of post-war conscience, a place where mercy and memory wrestled under the same sky. Outside, America celebrated victory. Inside, its captives rehearsed what would come after. So, if compassion is tested not when it's easy, but when it feels undeserved, where would you stand? Among those who withheld, or those who dared to give again? The years passed, and history moved on, but small things refused to vanish. In the spring of 1947, the women of Fort Devens were repatriated to a Europe still smoldering from the war's ruin. Their journey home was long, a train to New York Harbor, a ship to Le Havre, and finally the endless miles of track into a continent where the cities were unrecognizable. Most of them returned not to houses, but to craters. Helga Klein carried one suitcase, a Red Cross blanket, and the thin prayer book that hid the folded note. Anna Voigt carried a tin box with seeds saved from the camp garden, wrapped in paper labeled Texas, 1946. The two women parted in Bremen. Helga went south to Bonn, Anna east toward the Soviet zone, where letters would no longer cross. Their last exchange of words was a single promise: "We will meet again when something grows." Decades blurred the memory. The flowers from Fort Devens were long gone, the soil paved over, yet some fragments survived. In 1999, at the Frauen im Krieg, Women in War exhibition at the Bonn City Museum, a small glass case displayed two dried daisies pressed between parchment. The label beneath them read, "Gifted by a girl from Texas to a German POW, 1945. Visitors passed by quickly, not realizing how many lives those petals had once touched. But one elderly woman lingered longer than the rest. Her hands trembled as she traced the glass. It was Helga, then 78, recognizing the handwriting on the small tag. She whispered to a curator that she had once known the child's flowers, though she never knew the child's name. The curator noted her words in the exhibition guest book. A few lines later, someone else wrote, "My grandmother was that girl." No one ever confirmed it, but the entry remained. 2 generations quietly completing a circle history had left open. Those pressed daisies, color drained, stems brittle, were the last surviving witnesses of a moment when compassion dared to bloom in a place meant only for division. Each petal carried both guilt and grace, the echo of barbed wire and the warmth of a stranger's hand. Outside the museum, Bonn was quiet that night. A light rain fell, the kind that makes the city's cobblestones shine. Somewhere, perhaps in Texas or Georgia, Another old woman was still alive, unaware that the flowers she once placed on a prisoner's truck had outlasted the war itself. Wars, after all, do not end when treaties are signed or cannons fall silent. They end when someone, somewhere, still dares to give a flower to the one who once caused their pain, and another human being is brave enough to accept it. History often hides its gentlest truths in the quiet corners of memory. The story of those women, captured, shamed, yet slowly rehumanized through gestures as small as a bouquet or a seed, reminds us that peace is not a treaty, but a practice. The war had trained millions to see the world in uniforms, friend or foe, victor or vanquished. But what happened in that American town, on that dusty road where a child lifted her hand to offer daisies, was something far more subversive. It was a rebellion of empathy. No speeches, no governments, no declarations. Just people choosing not to let hatred be the final word. Each act of kindness inside those camps was an answer to the propaganda that had promised eternal enmity. Every loaf of bread, every packet of seeds, every look that softened instead of condemning became a small revolt against the machinery of dehumanization. Time eventually buried the camps, the fences, the barbed wire. Yet the flowers endured, pressed in museum glass, planted in backyards, remembered in letters. They became proof that decency can outlive ideology. Perhaps that is what history truly asks of us. Not to remember only who fought, but who forgave. Not to glorify victory, but to recognize the courage it takes to offer a hand when it still trembles with pain. Because in the end, the world is built not by those who win wars, but by those who dare to mend what war has broken.